Brook Weber thought her life was over the night she was buried alive. But what her captor, Jalen Thorne, didn't know was that survival was in her blood. While he believed he had gotten away with murder, Brook was fighting for her life in the darkness, preparing for a comeback that would shatter his twisted world forever. What happened next would send shockwaves through their quiet town as the truth emerged from the earth itself. Brook Weber's last known steps were ordinary. She left a cozy brick-walled art gallery in downtown Ludlow after attending a small exhibition for a local painter. Rain had started to fall, tapping against the sidewalks and the tops of parked cars. Brook, dressed in a light trench coat, stepped out with her phone in hand, glanced at a message, and tucked it into her pocket. That was the last confirmed sighting of her. The gallery owner remembered her smile, her usual thank you wave. Then, like a light switched off, she was gone. The following morning, her boss noticed she hadn't shown up for work, which was unusual. Brook was punctual, organized, and kept a strict routine. She wasn't someone who went off-grid. A voicemail was left, then another, still nothing. By afternoon, Taya Lorne, her closest friend, was growing nervous. Taya called around to Brook's building manager, her other friends, even her yoga instructor. No one had seen her. Her apartment was locked, mail untouched, lights off. It didn't feel right. Taya drove to the police station and filed a missing person report. At first, it was logged as a routine case. Brook was an adult. Maybe she needed space. Maybe she left town. But those closest to her disagreed. She had no history of mental health issues, no recent emotional stress, no travel plans. Her dog Bean was left alone in her apartment, something Brook would never do. The dog had been barking non-stop when neighbors called in a noise complaint, prompting the landlord to check inside. That's when they knew something was wrong. Detectives began piecing together her last known movements. Security camera footage from the art gallery confirmed she left around 8:12 p.m. She walked down a narrow alley connecting to a small lot behind the gallery where she usually parked. But her car was still there the next morning. On the footage, a shadowy vehicle pulled into the alley just minutes after Brook disappeared from view. The camera quality was poor due to the rain, but one detail stood out: a white truck with a black and red diagonal stripe across the tailgate. The license plate wasn't readable, but the vehicle type was distinctive. It wasn't much to go on, but it was something. Detective Mavis Renn, a seasoned investigator known for trusting her instincts, took interest. She ordered a wider canvass of the area, checking surrounding businesses for more footage. Most cameras had limited visibility due to the storm, but a gas station 2 blocks away had a better angle. It captured a vehicle matching the truck's description, heading west toward the outskirts of town around 8:24 p.m. A single taillight was dimmer than the other. That would be the next thread to pull. Meanwhile, the Weber family arrived from out of state. They helped confirm details about Brook's habits, friends, and routines. They mentioned something that Taya hadn't brought up: Brook's brief toxic relationship with a man named Jalen Thorne. Brook had ended things months earlier, claiming he was possessive and unpredictable. He'd shown up at her job once, demanding to talk, but there had been no recent contact, at least none they were aware of. Still, it was a lead. Detectives ran Jalen's name. He had no criminal record, but he lived outside of town in a rural area, alone. He worked as a carpenter and was known for doing construction on remote properties. A perfect occupation for someone who wanted to hide things. At this point, suspicion grew, but suspicion wasn't evidence. The pressure increased with every passing day. Search parties combed wooded areas. Volunteers posted flyers. Social media lit up with Brook's photo and pleas for help. Yet, no one could answer the one question that echoed louder than all the others. Where did Brook Weber go after she stepped into the rain that night? Jalen Thorne lived at the edge of town in a weather-worn house surrounded by tall grass and broken fencing. His property backed into dense woods that stretched for miles with no neighbors in sight, the kind of place where no one would hear a scream. When detectives arrived to question him, he appeared calm, almost too calm. He wore a faded sweatshirt and dusty jeans, his hands stained with grease and sawdust. He said he hadn't seen Brook in weeks and barely reacted when told she was missing. Jalen explained that he had spent the evening of Brook's disappearance, working alone at a cabin he was remodeling deep in the forest, about 40 miles out. No witnesses, no time-stamped receipts, and no cell signal in that area. He shrugged off the lack of an alibi, claiming he liked the solitude and often camped overnight to finish projects. When asked about the truck seen near the gallery, the one with the unique stripe, he denied being in town that night. His truck was in his garage, he said. It hadn't moved. Detectives asked to see it. The vehicle matched the description exactly. White body, black and red diagonal stripe on the tailgate, and one dim rear light. Jalen insisted the truck hadn't left his property in days. But when they checked the wheel wells, they found wet mud, fresh, thick, and still clinging to the tires. Rain had only fallen in the area the night Brook disappeared. Jalen claimed it must have come from an earlier trip, but his story was beginning to crack. They also noticed small scratches on his left wrist. He claimed they were from handling lumber. That could be true, but they weren't taking anything at face value anymore. Detective Renn requested access to the cabin Jalen mentioned. He agreed, offering to lead them there. The road was narrow and unpaved, cutting through thick pine trees until it opened into a clearing where a partially built structure stood. The cabin appeared abandoned at first glance. Dusty tools sat inside, and half the walls were unfinished. But something was off. A section of the floor was covered in new concrete, smooth, pale grey, and untouched by dust. It stood out against the rough, weathered floorboards around it. Renn asked why that section had been poured. Jalen claimed it was to level the foundation. She requested ground-penetrating radar. The scan showed nothing beneath the concrete but soil. Still, the timing of the new cement, laid just days after Brook vanished, raised alarms. It felt less like renovation and more like cover-up. Yet legally, they still didn't have enough to hold him. Forensics teams took samples from the cabin, fibers, dust, trace elements. One technician noticed something odd. A piece of cloth, partially buried in the dirt, outside, behind the cabin. It had a faint pattern, like the sleeve of a coat. It was torn and slightly bloodied. Testing later confirmed the blood matched Brook Weber's type, but it wasn't enough. Meanwhile, Tia continued pushing investigators, compiling every shred of information she could find. She dug into Jalen's past and discovered that he had lived in another state 2 years earlier, in a small town called Redding. A woman had gone missing there under eerily similar circumstances. She vanished without a trace. No suspects, no body, case closed. The name of the missing woman was Elise Grant. Her description bore an uncanny resemblance to Brook. Same height, hair color, age range. When this was brought to light, Detective Renn contacted authorities in Redding to reopen the files. The details were chilling. Elise had last been seen leaving a local bookstore. Her car was later found near a construction site. The primary person of interest had been dismissed due to lack of evidence. His name had never been released to the public, but now it was in front of Detective Renn, Jalen Thorne. 3 weeks had passed since Brook Weber disappeared. and hope was slowly draining from the town of Ludlow. Candlelight vigils had been held. Volunteers had searched trails, creek beds, and abandoned sheds. The missing person flyers, once crisp and fresh, now fluttered in the wind, rain-streaked and weathered. Detectives continued their work, but with each day, leads faded, energy dwindled, and silence lingered. Then everything changed with one phone call from a remote corner of the county. Harlan Dries was a retired farmer who spent most of his days maintaining his property, which spanned several acres of woodland. That morning, he was fixing a collapsed section of fence along the tree line near a dry creek bed. As he worked, he noticed something unusual, an area of soil that looked fresher than the rest. At first, he thought it might have been animals digging, but the pattern was too neat, too deliberate. Curious, Harlan grabbed a shovel from his shed and began to dig. Just a few inches down, the edge of a wooden box surfaced. What he found would haunt him forever. The box was roughly the size of a small freezer, sealed shut with rusty nails and iron latches. Air holes had been drilled into the sides, 6 of them, evenly spaced. With trembling hands, Harlan pried the top open and looked inside. There was no body, but what he saw was horrifying. The interior of the box had scratch marks, long deep gouges along the wood, as if someone had clawed at it in desperation. Bits of fingernails were embedded in the grain. One corner held a torn bracelet. Another had a stained piece of fabric, and the entire interior smelled of blood, sweat, and fear. Harlan backed away and called the sheriff. Soon, police and forensic teams arrived. The entire box was lifted from the earth and transported to a forensic lab. Initial analysis confirmed the fabric inside matched a coat Brook had been seen wearing the night she disappeared. A small drop of blood on the wood matched her blood type. The bracelet was one her sister had gifted her for her birthday, just months earlier. Investigators were forced to confront a horrifying reality. Brook had been buried alive, but if she had died in the box, where was her body? The most shocking detail was that the box was empty. No remains, no trace of decomposition, only evidence of a struggle. This meant something else, something no one had dared hope. Brook might have escaped. Detective Renn immediately ordered a new search around the area. Tracking dogs were brought in to scan for scent trails. Teams fanned out from the site, moving through the thick brush and overgrown trails. They found broken branches, smudged footprints, and a makeshift rope of torn fabric tied to a tree trunk nearby, possibly used to climb out of a steep ditch. It now appeared Brook had escaped the box and made it out of the woods. But how far had she gotten? And if she had survived, why hadn't she contacted anyone? Back at the police station, Jalen Thorne was brought in for another round of questioning. When told that the box had been discovered, his demeanor shifted. He went pale, his voice quieter. But still, he said nothing incriminating. Without definitive proof that he had built the box or placed it there, detectives could only watch him leave once again, behind closed doors. Detective Renn believed one thing. Jalen thought she was dead, and if Brook had made it out, if she was, somewhere out there, she held the answers they needed. All they could do now was wait for a phone call, a sighting, a break. Because for the first time in weeks, the case wasn't just about finding a body. It was about finding a survivor, miles away from the town of Ludlow. Deep within the rugged backcountry, Brook Weber was alive. Her escape from the wooden box had pushed her body to its limits. In total darkness, she had used her elbows and knees to force upward, clawing through the soil that pressed down on her like a coffin lid. The box had been buried shallowly, either by accident or design. but the layers of packed dirt still made each breath feel like drowning. Somehow, with broken nails and bloodied hands, she broke through. Her body surfaced like a ghost, rising from the grave, disoriented and trembling. She crawled out into the night, rain washing mud from her face. She had no phone, no shoes, and no idea where she was. She wandered through the dense woods for hours, legs weak and lungs burning, driven only by the will to survive. Each step felt like it might be her last. The only sounds were her own ragged breaths and the wind whispering through the trees. By dawn, Brook stumbled upon a slow-moving creek. She drank, bathed her face, and collapsed near a fallen log. That's where she remained for nearly a day, drifting in and out of consciousness. When she woke again, the sun was low and the air cooler. She forced herself to move. Her instinct told her to follow the creek downstream, and so she did, step by painful step. After nearly 2 days, Brook came upon a cabin hidden within the forest. It wasn't empty. An older woman named Marla lived there alone, surviving off the grid. She found Brook half-conscious outside, coated in dirt and bruises, lips cracked from dehydration. Marla brought her inside, gave her water and food, and cleaned her wounds. Brook couldn't speak at first. Trauma had sealed her voice. She wrote her name shakily on a napkin, but it took time for it to make sense to her rescuer. Marla had no cell phone or television, just a radio and a landline that didn't always work. She didn't know who Brook Weber was, or that people were looking for her. Brook stayed in the cabin for nearly a week. She healed slowly, physically and mentally. Her voice returned in fragments. When Marla finally hiked down to a nearby gas station, she used their phone to call a rural clinic to help her new guest. Brook was transported by ambulance. At the clinic, nurses suspected she had been a victim of abuse, maybe even trafficking. But once Brook regained enough strength to explain, the pieces began to fall into place. A nurse typed her name into a missing persons database. That same evening, Detective Renn's office received the alert. Brook Weber had been found. She was alive. Barely, but alive. Authorities rushed to the clinic to meet her. Brook's face was swollen, her eyes heavy with exhaustion, but her words were clear. She described everything. How Jalen had lured her under false pretenses. How he drugged her. How she woke up inside a box in darkness, buried alive. She remembered the smell of soil, the feel of splinters under her nails, the suffocating fear of dying alone underground. Her story broke the case wide open. Every detail matched the box found on Harlan Drees's property. The bracelet, the torn fabric, even the air holes. Jalen Thorne had not counted on Brook surviving. He had assumed the earth would keep his secret, that her final screams would never be heard. But now, not only was Brook alive, she was ready to tell the world what he had done. And across town, while Jalen began preparing to leave, thinking the heat had cooled, the police were already on their way. Brook Weber had escaped death, and now she was bringing it back to his door. The news of Brook's survival hit like a thunderclap, shattering the silence that had surrounded the investigation for weeks. The moment Detective Mavis Renn received confirmation that Brook was alive, the case took a dramatic turn. What had once seemed like a tragic disappearance was now a fight for justice, one that was far from over. It was no longer just about finding Brook's body. It was about ensuring that Jalen Thorne would never harm anyone again. Jalen had been under the radar for so long. His quiet life in the woods, concealing his dark nature. He assumed that with Brook gone, with no body to be found, he could finally slip back into his routine of isolation. He hadn't counted on Brook's will to survive, nor had he expected the unrelenting determination of Detective Renn and her team. As the investigation ramped up again, police swarmed his property. They went over it with a fine-tooth comb, searching every inch of the cabin, every tool, every corner where something might be hidden. When police arrived at his doorstep, Jalen's face turned pale. He tried to maintain his composure, but it was clear that he knew the jig was up. He had been waiting for this moment, knowing that Brook's survival would eventually expose him. He still clung to his denial, insisting that he had no part in her disappearance. But there was no room for doubt anymore. Brook's testimony was the final piece of the puzzle. Sitting in a sterile room, still recovering from her physical and emotional trauma, she recounted the horrors she had endured. Her voice was shaky, but resolute as she described Jalen's actions in chilling detail. She spoke of the manipulation, the drugging, the lies. She told them about the cabin, the buried box, and how she had been forced to fight for her life in the face of certain death. She recalled the terror of being trapped underground, unable to see, to breathe, to move, knowing that if she didn't escape, she would never see the world again. Jalen, for all his bravado, couldn't escape the weight of the evidence that piled up against him. Detective Renn and her team had gathered a mountain of it. The blood on the box, the fresh mud on his truck, the torn fabric that matched Brook's clothing, and most damning of all, the traces of her presence in his cabin. His alibi had crumbled under the pressure. There was no way to explain how his truck had been caught on surveillance footage near the gallery the night Brook vanished. If he had been hours away at the cabin, there was no way to justify the new concrete floor in his cabin, poured just days after she had gone missing. But even as the case seemed to be closing in on him, Jalen maintained a cold silence. He never admitted guilt outright. He never begged for mercy. Instead, he simply watched as Brook, bruised but unbroken, stood tall in front of the court. Her bravery in the face of overwhelming fear was unmatched. She had been buried alive. She had escaped. And now she was bringing the man responsible to justice. The trial was swift, with the prosecution presenting the evidence methodically, carefully placing each piece of the puzzle before the jury. Brook's testimony was the most powerful part of the case, and as she spoke, the courtroom fell silent. The room felt like it held its breath as she described every detail of her torment. The jury listened intently, and in the end, there was no doubt. Jalen Thorne was found guilty of attempted murder, kidnapping, unlawful confinement, and assault. When the verdict was announced, Brook sat with her hands clasped together in her lap. She didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. Instead, she quietly nodded, knowing that justice had been served, knowing that the man who had tried to kill her would never harm anyone again. For Brook, this moment wasn't about revenge. It was about survival. She had faced death, and she had won. Jalen Thorne was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He would never see the outside world again. For Brook, it was the beginning of a new chapter. She still had a long road ahead of her, physically, emotionally, and mentally. But she had already proven the one thing that mattered most. She was stronger than he had ever believed. She had escaped their box. She had survived the darkness, and she had reclaimed her life